What food did you hate as a child because of the way it was prepared, only to find out as an adult it was amazing when made correctly? Basically, everything. My mother was a good person who loved her family. But she couldn't cook for shit. Everything was boiled until it was grey. And the meat was dried to holy hell, and the vegetables had the consistency of pudding. Her only move in the kitchen was to put a not even cleaned of connective tissue hunk of whatever animal we were desecrating tonight for dinner in a 350-degree oven. In a roasting pan with too much water. Often for 3 or more hours. It never one time occurred to her to try lowering the heat or the cooking time. But she always complained that white meat is dry. Yeah. Because you basically scorched the shit out of it. I fired her from cooking duties at 14, and it was the best move I ever made. I'm no Michelin star chef. But I'll make you happy at my table. Pot roast. I hated how dry and flavorless it was. I actually wrote an essay about it in my English class. The teacher showed it to my mom and she changed up her recipe lol. I didn't understand the fuss around steak when I was a kid. But then I realized it was because my very neurotic mother would cook me and my brother's pieces too well done and beyond because she was so afraid of us getting food poisoning. Her heart was in the right place. But she didn't need to serve us shoe leather haha. Vegetables. All of them basically. My mom would boil them to sludge every time. My neighbor, he's 80 plus now, told me a funny story relating to this. He grew up in rural WV. When he was in his 20s, he was doing some odd job work in the city for a woman homeowner. At the end of a day of work, she offered to cook him dinner. She asked, "Do you like steak?" Quote. He said, "Yay, I guess." She said, "How do you take it?" Quote. He didn't understand what that meant. She says, "How would you like it done?" Quote. He still didn't get it. He says, "Cooked?" Quote. This is the day he learned of doneness for steak. The first time he'd heard of food being able to be done by request. He had never had any meat that wasn't fried to a crisp. He said his mother made everything the same way. Fry it or boil it down. She would put fat in the pan and fry the meat. He said this particular steak and meal was the best he'd ever had in his life. First time tasting properly cooked food. Eggplant. Pan-fried it was nasty, and then I traumatized myself by getting rid of it by burying it in the flower bed by the front door, and all the flowers died. Husband uses like a pancake batter and it's great. Mayo. Didn't realize there was a difference between Miracle Whip and mayo, and my mom only bought Miracle Whip. I hated cranberries for most of my life because all I ever had was canned cranberry jelly. Then, a friend of mine had a Friendsgiving and someone brought homemade cranberry sauce and it changed everything. Mashed potatoes. My mom didn't believe in butter. Pork chops and steaks were shit until I realized they should not actually be prepared for use in the NHL. I love my mom dearly, and for that, I must keep her out of the kitchen for her safety and that of the world. Roast beef and steak. I always found it dry and hard to chew and eat. Basically it was way overdone or cheap cuts. Brussels sprouts. Apparently boiling the shit out of something until they're mushy and watery is not great. Lightly grilled, broiled with some oil and seasoning, and they're one of my favorite dishes. Spinach. My dad would only eat canned spinach that was then boiled. Found out later that fresh spinach is a wonderfully flavorful green and is best either crisp or cooked until slightly wilted. Everything. My mother could burn a tossed salad. Meatloaf. My parents were in love with a specific teriyaki sauce they bought in 2-gallon jugs from Costco, and drowned an otherwise plain lump of ground beef with and called that a teriyaki glazed meatloaf. It oughta be a crime. Flash forward to my seasoned beef, pork mix with Italian herbs, Parmesan, and just the right amount of a sweet, spicy tomato glaze, and it's just a different world we live in. Turns out lasagna is much better than nasty burnt Stouffer's. Any type of meat. My mom grew up in the "better burn it or you'll get worms" generation. Turns out the bun can make or break a hamburger. My mom used to always prepare them with these wheat buns, so I used to never like hamburgers. Took me a few years to realize they're really good with a more standard sesame, brioche, or potato bun. One of my favorite foods nowadays. Daughter of Depression-era parents here. Grew up with a lot of canned, tinned vegetables. Jesus. Canned asparagus is tough. Sinewy and slimy all at the same time. Freshly steamed with a pat of butter is amazing. Even now when I mention it's one of our favorites, my older relatives gasp and say, "You buy it out of season?" Like we're billionaires. Everything. My mother insisted that everything be cooked exactly as her mother cooked it. Problem is, my grandparents were Depression-era. Dirt poor. Lived in the absolute middle of nowhere. And never ate in restaurants or traveled or watched cooking shows or bought cookbooks that weren't printed by the local church ladies. So their idea of spices was sugar, salt, pepper, and cinnamon. So that's all my parents ever used. Everything was bland as hell and just tasted like the grease it was fried in. Unless it was boiled. Then it just tasted like nothing. The only way anything was ever cooked was boiled or fried into oblivion. Ethnic food meant spaghetti or nachos. Or lasagna hamburger helper. The whole extended family was that way. I remember my aunt talking in a scandalized tone about the time my cousin went to a school friend's for dinner and the friend's mom put a bunch of stuff on the chicken and then put it in the oven and baked it. It wasn't until my 20s that I had food cooked differently than my family's, and I was still so deep in the fog that I was an insanely picky eater until my 30s and refused to try new foods, assuming I wouldn't like them.